What is it about Alaska that's just so darn creepy? Maybe it's the miles and miles of barren wilderness. Maybe it's the complete desolation, thick, untamed woods, and the legends and tales of what truly exist. In tonight's video, we're going to explore a handful of tales brought to me by a gal who calls herself Crystal. She has a handful of strange and terrifying experiences up in Alaska. But before we get into today's video, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button because I release storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural every other day. Let's go. Crystal's story starts on Wrangell Island. She had lived in a trailer park neighborhood that had sat across the road from a beach on the ocean. A forest had sat to the left, and behind them a mountain. And they were the last house on their street, so they were the closest to the hills and woods and furthest from the rest of the homes in the subdivision. Wrangell is a rainforest, so the woods are thick, wet, and foreboding, but mossy, plentiful, and eerily beautiful. The year before, they had moved off the island and Crystal was only around 5 years old, and Halloween had just rolled around. People would be roaming all over the neighborhood in scary costumes at that age. She was well aware of that and used to it. Trick-or-treaters came and went in their wide variety of festive attire. The night grew old and they all went to bed. At some point in the middle of the night, Crystal had woken up to what sounded like whispering and the intense feeling that she was being watched. She looks all over her room but saw nothing. She looks up at the window and that's when she sees it. It was so terrifying. She covers her face and screamed. What she saw was so tall that it had to look down at her from the top of her window. Their house was only one level, but it was significantly raised. Now, this thing, she described, had red eyes, thick dark brown blackish fur, and almost a humanoid mixed face with some wolf in it. Her mom ran into the room to see what was wrong with her, and when she told her what she saw and pointed, it was already gone. Crystal guessed the word she used to explain it back then was wolfman. She's not exactly sure what she saw, but she knows what she did not see. And it was not a person in a costume. She knows that even though she was very young, the memory has stuck with her for all of these years, and she expects it'll never be forgotten. She never saw it again, but recently had watched one of my videos about the history of Bigfoot and Wolfman or werewolf sightings and other encounters, and she's confident that that's what she had saw, and that's the being that was looking down in on her on that very night. Now, her second experience, the same island, exact place of residence, but a year prior to the werewolf thing. She had been playing in the woods directly to the left of the house, and her dad had cleared some brush and made a tire swing in a tree for her older brother and her, and her mother could watch them through the window from there. Her brother was hogging the swing one day, so she got distracted chasing a tiger swallowtail butterfly further into the woods. And as she looks up, arms outstretched trying to catch this butterfly, she runs into something. Something that wasn't there. It was because she had just run her face right into it, but she couldn't see anything. As a child, this didn't scare her as it should have. It just made her curious. She stood there running her hands up and down and across this thing, trying to feel her way past it, but seemingly could not. It was like she was running her hands across solid air. Looking through, it seemed to have a slight blur, but beyond that, she could not understand what was blocking her path. She turned and went back towards her brother, telling him and their parents what she had experienced, but of course, they had no way to explain it, so they simply shrugged it off. Years later, she found out that there was a rocky cliffside just there through the woods where she had been stopped. So perhaps God himself had blocked the path to protect her tiny unaware self from falling face first off a cliff. Who knows? Still, she also entertained the possibility that it was either an invisible force field or some sort of one of those glimmermen or invisible beings or cloaked Bigfoots that, a lot of us hear about encountering in the woods at national parks. After all, their residence was within a national park area, the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, and she has heard stories about disturbing things happening there. That brings us to the third experience. Same island, same residence, and right around the same time that she had saw the furry wolfman creature. So this is right around the exact same time as experience number 1. It's summertime in the wee morning hours, and Crystal and her whole family, everyone is sleeping. A noise or a voice had woke her, and she tries to get up out of bed. The problem was she could not move. Her mind awake and brain began working. Her arms and legs wouldn't move but a twitch. She starts crying and calling out to her mother and father. They answered her, but she couldn't understand what they were saying, and they did not come to her aid. She tried to go back to sleep because she was sure that this was just a horrible dream, but she could not. After a while, with no idea how long, she could pull herself out of bed, but she fell flat on the floor as her legs somehow did not work. She used her arms to pull herself slowly down the hall to her parents' bedroom and found them awake and lucid, but also paralyzed. Her brother was also hollering from the other side of the house, saying he could not move either. After at least an hour, perhaps more, they all regained their functions and spent all day talking about it. They couldn't fathom what had just happened to every one of them. They all explained how it felt as though they had been stunned by something. Crystal's mom was awake before everyone else, as she always is, and she said that a ray of light had shot straight through the house for a split second when it hit her. And they knew calling the cops wouldn't solve anything and would only make them all look crazy. In Crystal's family, they only went to the hospital if they were bleeding or broken, so they just sat there, confused, concerned, and on guard for weeks after that. This weird happening never happened again after that, but it is still discussed by the family to this day. They found out sometime later, after moving off the island, that apparently the government was doing all sorts of experiments on the island. Maybe, just maybe, they had conducted experiments on the island's residents, and they just happened to be the unfortunate victims. Experience number 4. Same island, same residents, roughly the same time frame. It rained all the time there. So it wasn't unusual to have plans crashed by a downpour. Her brother wanted to go outside and play, but it had been raining so heavily that he couldn't. As soon as the rain let up, he put on his boots and jacket to go play out front. He was out there maybe an hour when he came in saying he didn't feel good and that he had found some weird green goo on the leaves of all the plants outside. Within hours, her brother was highly sick, like he might be dying. Crystal's mom had remembered what he had said about the green goo, so she went outside and, sure enough, there was this strange, slimy light green substance on the surface of the leaves of pretty much every plant and bush outside. Crystal's mom didn't touch this stuff because she suspected that it played a role in her son's illness. And who in their right mind would? Green goo on everything, including her car? This was in the late 90s. They didn't have any medical coverage and were very poor. So the mom, a previous nurse, had nursed her brother back to health from home. But they were all worried sick that he would die because his illness, from whatever this green goo was so severe. The rain had washed it away within a day, leaving no trace. They never saw anything like it again, but Crystal had heard a story told by a man named Gary Rinchinch, who's a retired Area 51 security officer with top secret cosmic clearance. He talks about walking on his ranch with his wife when they both get hit with something wet on the backs of their neck, and they get so sick that they almost die. He also claims that deep underground military bases, also known as DUMBs, house secret government technology, Nephilim giants, hybrids, and reptilians that work their way through the military. That's fascinating if you're into that kind of thing, and informs us to look up the YouTube channel Night God 333 for stories and documents from the US military about the actual existence and real experiences and encounters with these supposed creatures. The truth will likely blow all of our minds as it's been heavily documented by their military and government. Now, this brings us to experience number 5. This one is about something that Crystal had experienced after leaving Wrangell Island when she had moved just outside of Anchorage, Alaska. The sky can be hard to see at night if you reside within a city surrounded by lights, but if you live outside the city, you'd be shocked by what you can see in the night sky. The Alaskan night sky is no exception, and they also have the aurora borealis, the northern lights. After leaving the island, they moved into the Willowa subdivision and lived there for around 11 years. Parents divorced, and they all left the neighborhood. Years after that, when Crystal had grown up and left home, she found a place for rent in the same area on the same road. So, she had jumped at the opportunity. While occupying this residence, her roommates were throwing a Halloween party, and she has never really been the partying type, so she distanced herself as best as she could. The noise and music inside the house got too much, so she took a quick trip to the store for snacks, returning home, sat in her car, and then decided to watch the stars from outside in the trunk of her car while eating her snacks. Someone came outside to smoke a cigarette and struck up a conversation with Crystal. Thus, she was distracted and no longer watching the night sky. Before too long, this person and her finished up and went back inside, so she returned to her stargazing. Immediately, she notices something as odd as there were now 3 bright green lights arranged in a sort of triangle sitting in the center of the sky before her. The sky was black, and she did not see that these lights were attached to anything specific, like a craft of some sort, but she watched on, knowing full well that these weren't normal. Before a moment had passed, these 3 lights all at once up and turned sideways as if they were part of a flying craft and took off at lightning speed. It left no light trail or any trace it was ever there. It was silent and moved so fast and effortlessly that it looked like nothing she'd ever seen. Her mother detailed seeing a giant disc-shaped UFO as a child in the 70s, playing hide-and-seek under a North Idaho sky during the day. Her sisters and other children had witnessed the same thing. It blocked out the sun and blackened the sky for a short time until it passed and disappeared into the horizon. She still talks about it to this very day. Experience number 6. This one took place about 45 minutes outside Anchorage near a small town called Big Lake, Alaska, that she had lived in at the time. She was 20 years old and worked the graveyard shift as a nurse at a local retirement home. This meant that she'd get off work during the wee hours of the morning while it was still pitch black outside, and on the drive home, the sun would rise. She was on an empty highway, driving her short commute from work at home, and saw these 3 highly bright lights in front of her. They were moving towards her, and at first, she thought, "Gee, thanks for blinding me with your brights, you jackwagon." As she thought this, that it must be a trucker or some person sporting fog lights or bright LEDs, she was wrong. The closer she came to these lights, the bigger and brighter they became, until they seemed to merge into one ample light, as it seemed like whatever it was playing tricks with her. It got so close that she freaked out, pulling off onto the shoulder of the road. She thought, could I be witnessing a plane crash, an emergency landing, something like that? But after it passed, she whipped herself around in the car to see what it was, and there was nothing there. Not a car, a truck, a semi, a train, a plane, just nothing. There was no sound but light wind. No lights, as there was no traffic on the road with her at this time. She couldn't believe it. She put the car in gear, shut it off as it was a manual, and got out of the car to get a full view and try to understand what was going on. There was no way. She saw it close enough to her, yet nothing was there. She still has no explanation for what happened that early in the morning and was the only one there to see it. The only thing she's heard about this is that it resembles the encounter of the Min Min lights in Australia. Videos of which that I just recently covered, which you can check out here. And this brings us to experience number 7. This one has nothing to do with the supernatural or extraterrestrial. She was 21, renting a house in a neighborhood almost precisely where the previous experience had occurred. In the back of this neighborhood was a large gravel pit owned by the state. Throughout the surrounding woods and neighborhoods are numerous trails the size of dirt roads that kind of bob and weave and cross over themselves and around this well-known river called the Little Susitna River. This area is a popular spot for locals to camp freely, fish freely, mob ATVs, get muddy, and host large bonfire gatherings and summer water sports, like rafting and the whole works. Living in the neighborhood meant that they were close enough to hang out whenever they wanted, day or night. And this one night, she was riding in the back of her friend Dan's truck, and they were out headed there to watch the stars and smoke some herb. After all, it is legal there in Alaska. They sat and smoked for maybe 10 minutes and, for whatever reason, decided to leave. But Dan had pulled down too close to the water and now became stuck in the sand, spinning out as he tried to pull away. So he got out to assess the situation. A whole 5 seconds after he steps out, they had heard him talking to someone, and Crystal said, "Who are you talking to?" He replied, "You guys had better get out here." So they all did with haste, and they see this middle-aged man dressed roughly in his 50s, really rough, super dirty, smoking a self-rolled filterless cigarette down to nothing with a large gun resting on his shoulder. He said nothing. He couldn't take his eyes off them, and they couldn't take his eyes off him. Dan had asked him what he was doing out there, and the man didn't answer. Dan, already pretty creeped out by this, asked if he was the property owner or what. The man, never breaking a gaze, simply said no and kept smoking. As Dan tried to question the man, Crystal looked at him for the first time since she had really seen him, only to realize the kids surrounding them, who were all boys which were no older than 12, all were carrying guns. Not pistols or Daisy BB guns, these were shotguns and rifles. These boys looked different, had different skin colors and ethnicities, and were roughly 10 to 12 years old. They were all barefoot and filthy and had clothes too big or too small, and so holey and dirty that they were all as brown as the ground on which they stood on. She didn't hear much of Dan's conversation with the man, but the man never spoke more than a word at once. After they all realized that the seriousness of the situation was getting heightened, Dan just said, "Okay, we're going to leave now and leave your posse alone." They all piled into the truck at record speed, forgetting his truck was even stuck, and put it in gear, and they spun out for a solid minute as they panicked and prayed for the safety. Crystal was in the back seat, closest to these gun-brandishing rural folk, and the week previous, the back window had been bashed out by a piece of wood, so there was nothing between them and these people, which made her feel even more insecure. They got out of there as the truck gained traction and exited the woods and entered the gravel pit. As she turned around for one last look, there was a group of children with all guns, dressed about the same, closing in on the exit. They just pulled out of there, and Dan yells an explanation and began driving like a madman until they reached the house where his car was. Crystal had asked him why he had suddenly freaked out like that, and he said that there was a red dot on his dash, as if somebody was pointing a gun sight laser at him. He went back the following day just to see if there was any evidence of what they saw, and as expected, there wasn't anything to see. There were no signs of this homeless posse hanging around, and they did not go back there after that, afraid to see them again. She did make a police report because she thought how awful it would be if those children had been kidnapped or possibly victims, but maybe a part of human trafficking, but she had never heard of them or saw them again. This, of course, brings us to our final experience, number 8. When Crystal was 19, she had applied for a modeling job in Anchorage, doing a photo shoot wearing a new clothing brand. She didn't have a car then, so her boyfriend would have to take her. The employer kept saying not to bring anybody, but she explained her boyfriend would be bringing her, and this person freaked out on her. They told her to take a taxi and get dropped off, but she wasn't exactly comfortable with that and had no way of affording a cab for a two-way trip of an hour and a half both ways. Now this person began yelling and cursing at her, saying that she was ruining everything, calling her many nasty names before hanging up, and then repeatedly calling her back until she was forced to block the number. She didn't realize until later that it was likely a human trafficking trap, and she had ruined it for them by not being able to drive there alone. She was 18 when 18-year-old Samantha Koenig went missing and was found at a nearby lake. She was taken from a coffee stand, She too worked in Anchorage, and then her body was dumped at a nearby lake, a place that she had just been right before they had found her. The situation was even more impactful on her because she had recently graduated high school and signed up for a barista program in Anchorage, leading her to work at a coffee shop in Anchorage. It could have been her, and she thanks God it wasn't. What a tragic case that was. And along with these small handfuls of experiences, she has many more experiences to share, but this is all for now that she's written. And while all of these experiences took place in Alaska, she is currently residing in Idaho. And they are currently experiencing some off-the-wall things going on there, like rocks being thrown at them from the woods, screams and sounds like everyone else is called Bigfoot, and the sound of something hitting the trunks of trees and breaking trees as the rest of the wildlife noises fall silent, as if in the presence of a predator. But more importantly, what do you guys think? Are Crystal's stories all fabricated, or are they merely terrifying experiences with the natural and supernatural? Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as always, if you're new to my channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that big old red subscribe button for storytelling on the mysterious and supernatural. I love you guys, keep an open mind, and I'll check you all in the very next video.